Thank you, Chris, for joining us at the Right on Crime podcast. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
You wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your background for our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could talk about, but I think the most important part is kind of how I got interested in criminal justice. I enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard right out of high school. And when I graduated, they sent me off to the Northeast Regional Fisheries Training Center, NERF at Otis Air Force Base in New England to get my initial law enforcement training and certification. So I did fisheries enforcement, Coast Guard District 1 out of boot camp. And when I got out of the military, I had that taste for criminal justice issues. And so I got a degree at Boise State in criminal justice, did my senior internship at the Idaho Supreme Court, helping launch the first problem-solving courts in Idaho. It was a drug court back then. And by the end of college, I was just hooked on this idea of the law and living in a law and ordered society. I went off to get a law degree and a PhD in law and public policy. Years later, when I ran for the legislature, and I'm now a member of the Idaho House of Representatives, one of my kind of collateral duties was an appointment to the Idaho Criminal Justice Commission. And then a couple years ago, my membership was accepted at the National Council on Criminal Justice, which is really the nation's preeminent nonpartisan criminal justice think tank. Research, policy, whatever you need. And so that's kind of how I got to this specific issue today.
I know you've also spent time in the Idaho's school boards. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in education as well.
Yeah, well, I got into kind of education policy by way of the president's office at Boise State University. When I graduated with my PhD, I was in the process of doing some local emergency management consulting. Incident management and emergency preparedness is kind of what my academic background was in. And as I was doing that, my wife and I found out we were going to have a baby. And I said, oh my gosh, I don't have insurance. I don't have any of the things you need. So I ended up handling and managing the policy manual at Boise State University, which is kind of a strength of mine, kind of working with diverse groups of stakeholders on getting to yes over and over and kind of establishing policies for institutions. And that led me to the State Board of Education, where I served as the chief academic officer, kind of the provost and the academic officer for the state. So I have a lot of love for criminal justice. I have a lot of love for education. And to be quite honest, these are not mutually exclusive topics.
Which is exactly why I brought that up, because I know a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of the things that you're really passionate about are looking at ways that solutions can be identified and identifying populations that are really needing the opportunity to delve in, look at data, and identify ways that we as a population can identify those solutions. You had mentioned that you do work and are a part of the National Council on Criminal Justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that relates to us here in Idaho?
Yeah, you bet. So the Council on Criminal Justice, or CCJ, like I said, is kind of the nation's preeminent nonpartisan criminal justice think tank. Policy, research, whatever you need, whatever people who are on the front lines, making policy, running prisons, running law enforcement agencies, whatever they need, CCJ is the place to go to get the best information and options on how to move forward on things you might want to do. One of the ways they go about that is by impaneling certain types of commissions. They've had a Veterans Commission. They've had other commissions. And in 2024, I was appointed to CCJ's Women's Justice Commission. And the Women's Justice Commission is led by former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and is senior advised by the First Lady of Oklahoma, Sarah Stitt. And the mission of the commission is to really document and raise awareness of the distinct needs of women in the criminal justice system, and to kind of elevate and advocate for evidence-based pathways out of the situations we find our ways in. And this is relevant to us here in Idaho because Idaho incarcerates more women and girls than any other jurisdiction on the planet. And I say that not to be bombastic, but to be provocative. The United States incarcerates more people than any other nation, and Idaho is the highest incarcerator of women in the highest incarcerating nation in the world. So you can argue that we incarcerate more women and girls than any jurisdiction on the planet. And that's why I'm so passionate about trying to figure out a way out of this.
You bring up Oklahoma, and I know that that's a state that used to have the highest incarceration rate for women in the country, and Idaho has now taken that spot. Have you seen through the work of CCJ some of their best practices in Oklahoma that have really stood out to you, um, that you'd like to share with us, or any best practices overall that have stood out to you, and maybe from other states around the country to move the needle on those rates?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely put Oklahoma as kind of the model for, especially for conservative states, how to address, the size of their carceral states, whether for men or for women. And the reason that I put Oklahoma at the top is because, like you mentioned, until 2019, they had the highest female incarceration rate in the nation, and they decided in advance of that was not okay. That's a real problem, and they were going to take a number of steps to address that. And just last year, for example, the commission met in Tulsa, and First Lady Sarah Stitt was actually able to give us a tour. A lot of innovative programs and facilities in Tulsa. And it was in that process that we were able to learn about some of the things that policymakers have done there, frontline staff at some of these facilities. For example, one of the things that Oklahoma has done, and I don't think they were the first state to do it, but they were the first state to do it in a way that other states are starting to really pay attention. And that is they're starting to pass, and they passed, and Georgia has passed this subsequently, laws that are called Survivors Justice Acts. What a lot of people don't know is that almost every woman in prison was a victim of domestic violence. In Idaho, for example, almost every woman was a victim of domestic violence. They were almost all victims of sexual violence. In fact, 70% of the women in Idaho prisons were sexually abused before they turned 14.
Wow.
That's a shocking statistic, but it's not uncommon. And I think what Oklahoma realized a few years ago is there are things we can do to address this, to get rid of domestic violence as a primary driver of our female incarceration rate. One of the things they did was pass a Survivors Justice Act a few years ago. And what that says is it acknowledges that a lot of people in prison were victims of domestic and sexual abuse in their past. And that if they are able to demonstrate to the court during a sentencing phase that past victimization was highly relevant or causal to the crime they're being sentenced for, well, then judges are allowed to reduce that sentence a little bit to account for and correspond to the fact that they had been abused in the past. And so Oklahoma has done and is doing a lot of really important things. And in fact, when I was telling First Lady Stitt about what's going on here in Idaho, she was pretty clear with me. She's like, if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. So we're all in this together. No one wants to be the highest incarcerator of females. No one wants to have a carceral state that continues to grow and grow and grow unchecked. And so really, best practices around the country. CCJ is a great clearinghouse for identifying people and issues and best practices and evidence in that space. So it's an honor to be a member of CCJ, but it's also an honor to be able to learn from First Lady Sarah Stitt, Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and all of the other commissioners who many of them have lived this life for a long time. And there's a lot to be learned, but there's also, a lot we can do.
Sure. We've had Director Bree Derrick join us on the podcast, and she also shared with us the high incident of drug and alcohol related the cases with those that are incarcerated, for males, but especially for female inmates who are incarcerated. Have you seen correlation to that in other states? And are there any specific programs or any interventions that you've seen that have stood out to you through this work?
Yes, this is also common across states. In fact, even though almost every woman in prison was a domestic violence victim, what they were sentenced for was drug possession. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that domestic violence causes female incarceration, because what it does is it puts into motion a series of highly predictable events. In fact, I brought in a newspaper clipping last year, October of 2025. Colleague of mine, Representative Josh Wheeler from East Idaho District 35, and I wrote wrote a piece in I think it was the Coeur d'Alene Press, and it was designed to draw this connection between domestic violence and drugs. So if it's okay, I'd like to just read a
Sure.
paragraph
Yes,
or two
please.
from this. And this is about a woman, an Idahoan. Her name is Stephanie. She lives over in Idaho Falls, and she has talked about this story many times, but I think it's highly relevant, and it illustrates the relationship between domestic violence, drugs, and prison. At age 12, she was sexually abused by a family friend, and she reported the abuse, but her abuser was not criminally charged and remained free. So at 14, she was groomed into a relationship with a 34-year-old man who became her trafficker, controlling her through exploitation and violence and forcing her into a world of drugs. Stephanie was forced to serve as a drug mule, transporting narcotics from California to Idaho. When she resisted or tried to escape, she was sexually abused to pay off drug debt. For all of this victimization, she never received the victim services or support she needed and deserved. So it's hardly surprising that when she was 19, she was arrested in connection with a drug trafficking operation that she had been forced to participate in. So we can see that there is a relationship between domestic violence and drugs. And so I think one of the reasons that conservative states are more inclined to adopt Survivors Justice Act is because they're disinclined to change their drug laws. They don't want to ease up on their drug laws. So one thing they can do is acknowledge the role that domestic violence plays in causing women to commit drug crimes and thus be sentenced to prison.
Can you share with us some of the misconceptions on the ways that female incarceration issues differ from the ways that men's incarceration issues are?
So there's some important differences between male incarceration and female incarceration. Some of those differences are kind of self-evident if you think about them for a second, and some of them are not. So the ones that I think are self-evident are facilities construction costs, per inmate construction costs, for example. Since men are more violent, they commit more crimes, they're more predisposed to criminality, we build bigger facilities for them. And since there's more of them, we can achieve economies in scale that drive down construction costs. And you don't get those economies of scale when you're building facilities for women. So facilities costs are higher. So are their healthcare costs for obvious reasons. I mean, they're bringing other human beings into the world, many of them in carceral settings. Their healthcare costs are higher. So those are some of the obvious ones, but there are also some uncommon ones that a lot of people don't, or they're common, but people don't realize them. If you go into a visiting area at a men's prison, you're probably going to see people waiting to meet their family or their friend who's incarcerated. But that's not always true in a women's prison. Visitation rates at women's prisons are shockingly low, dangerously low, which undermines morale and all kinds of other things. So the fact that in men's prisons, people are much more inclined to visit than they are in women's prisons is a big, important difference. And another difference is the role that they play in driving foster care. 80% of the women who were sentenced to prison, at least in Idaho, were parents when they were arrested. And I think 70% of them were the primary caregivers of children when they were incarcerated. And what a lot of people don't know is that when a man gets sentenced to prison, if he is a parent, the other parent almost always becomes the primary caregiver. But when a woman gets sentenced to prison, if she's a parent, the other parent almost never becomes the primary caregiver. Those kids are lucky if they get to go to a grandparent or an aunt, and many of them don't. So what's happening is they are going into foster care. Locking up women is a huge driver of foster care services. So those are some of the big and differences between male and female incarceration.
I've also heard that successful reentry a lot of times is correlated upon connection to the outside world. So for those that have a really good support system while they are incarcerated, knowing that they have somebody that is coming, meeting with them, connecting them to something to look forward to when they are serving their time and reentering their home community. Do you see that differ between men who are incarcerated and women, kind of in that same vein that you were just providing an example?
It's certainly true for both, though the needs of women and men are just different in many cases. In many cases, they're the same, They both want to be able to pursue their passions and develop skills that will help them serve them on the outside. But in many instances, the unique challenges they face are different. Prisons were built for men. And so there are a lot of programs and services inside prisons that women don't necessarily have access to because, for example, there's not as many of them. And if a state is not willing to fund them because there's not as many of them, they're not going to have as many opportunities to develop skills or recover from addiction or learn how to parent while in prison so that when they are released on probation or parole, they have all of the parenting skills that they need or access to the parenting skills they need. One of the things that is a real challenge in all of this is how we treat, holding people accountable for violating the conditions of their release. Yes, it's important that people who break the law comply with the conditions of release, but there are a lot of assumptions that are built into our accountability policies. For example, we assume that when someone leaves prison, they're going to have a safe and affordable place to live, which is key. Being able to have a safe place to live is key to being able to hold down a job or make sure that your kids have what they need so protective services doesn't come and take them, thus, triggering a status offense for you and maybe sending you back to prison. We assume that people are going to have access to a job that pays them enough to put a safe, affordable roof over them and their kids' head. In Idaho today, especially in the Boise metro area, that's just not the case. We have a serious housing problem. And sure, the lack of affordable housing is a problem for regular folks. But imagine being a woman in prison who might not have had access to the job training and the counseling and the therapies that she needed, and then just being released to a place where she can't afford a house. So what happens in many of these instances is they are forced to go live with the one person they probably don't want to live with, but it's the only option they have, and that was their past abuser, which reinforces this cycle: abuse, drugs, crime, abuse, drugs, crime. And that's why there's so many status and technical violations among women who have been released from jails and prisons in Idaho and in many states.
For those of our viewers that might not understand a status or a technical violation, can you explain what that might look like?
Sure. In simplest terms, it's violating one of the rules that the court said you can't do when you leave. So if you did your time and you're being released and you were there on a drug offense, one of the conditions might be you cannot frequent locations that are known to have, drug use or drug interactions, which makes sense theoretically. But if the only place that a woman has to live is with her boyfriend that got her into drugs in the first place, where there's probably going to be drugs, well, when probation parole comes around and sees that she's in a place where drugs are frequented, well, then she just violated the conditions of her parole. That's a technical violation, status offense. And a lot of women in our prisons are there, not because they committed new crimes, but because it was so difficult for them to follow the rules to the T because of lack of housing, lack of jobs, lack of training that they could have gotten in prison. And I think I avoided your earlier question. Absolutely. When people have access to, the types of supports and programs that are shown to support successful reentry into civilian life, then yes, there's a lot of examples around the country around who's doing that really well. Job programs, things like that. And what I was saying earlier about kind of the gender-based aspects of prison program, these prisons and jails were built for men. They weren't built for women. So we make a lot of assumptions about what kinds of job programs women might want in prison: service, cosmetology, and things like that. We don't offer welding programs to women. We don't offer, truck driving to women. There's a lot of things we assume that only men want. Right. And a lot of women want these things too, but the system wasn't built for them. And that's why it's important that we have these conversations.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And that's actually one of the things that Director Derek talked about as well. I think we have these gender, misnomers where we just automatically put people into a certain box where we have these different career pathways that we think that they might want to work in, and they might not be the wages that they need in order to afford housing that would allow for them to be in a safe environment, especially as we look at the more rural parts of the state. And when I talk about rural, it really means outside of the great state of Ada, right? Outside of the Boise area, right down the road from us, very, very close. So I think that that's a really, really important point and something that we need to be talking about more, especially as we're talking to other business leaders just right down the road about the opportunity for them from a hiring perspective as they need to fill some of these open positions, but also as they're partnering with Idaho Correctional Industries, Department of Labor, and Department of Corrections, knowing that they can have really successful hires if they open up that hiring funnel.
And if I could just say, I think that that's a really powerful opportunity for the business community in Idaho, given our female incarceration rate, because the vast majority of women in our prisons aren't violent. They're not dangerous.
Right.
They're just victims, turn to drugs to cover up the symptoms and the pain and the suffering. So all they need is opportunities. Some of the hardest working people in the state, they've been through the most, they've got grit, they've got stick-to-itiveness and persistence. They just need opportunities. So the more we can do to break down unnecessary barriers that gives these women opportunities to work, provide for their kids, the better off we will all be.
Exactly. There seems to be a misconception that higher incarceration automatically means safer communities. And we know that that's not the case. Can you speak to that misconception?
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. And I think there's something that seems commonsensical about it. Like, oh yeah, we lock up a lot of people. That's why we're so safe. So the question needs to be is there a place that's equally safe but doesn't lock up as many people? And what's cool about Idaho is all we have to do is look to our neighbor to the south, Utah, who has a nearly identical violent crime rate. But for every 5 women we incarcerate, they only incarcerate 1. So what Utah has figured out is it's not about the number of women you incarcerate. It's around the type of women you incarcerate. They have figured out a way how to target those women who are uniquely dangerous or violent. And then for the rest of them, they've figured out how to help rehabilitate them, give them opportunities to get away from their abusers, get off drugs, and go back to being productive members of society. So it seems like it seems intuitive that locking up more people will make you safer, but all you have to do is just look around at other jurisdictions to see that that's not true.
As we think about ways to address Idaho's incarceration rates, and specifically since we're talking about women's incarceration, what would you propose? What do you think that we need to do here in Idaho?
Well, I think all good public policy making starts with a fundamental question is, what is the problem we're trying to fix? And on that specific question, I'm not sure there's enough people at the table. This legislative session, I only heard one other legislator even mention our female incarceration problem. If there's not going to be a problem that political and business leaders are going to talk about, well, then there's not enough space for people to come forward with possible options for fixing the problem. There's not a platform for the business community to come forward and say, hey, you know what? We actually have jobs that women with no evidence of violence or danger to society could do. Could we work with the Department of Corrections to figure out how to help them begin developing those skills while they're behind bars so that when they get released, they're ready to go? These are conversations we can't have if we haven't identified a problem. So I think the more we elevate this issue, the more people will be able to come to the table and provide options for addressing it. And once we have options, we'll be able to make selections as to which ones we want to pursue and implement. And then we'll be able to evaluate how implementation is going. And then we'll be able to feed lessons learned back into implementation. And we'll be able to engage in this cycle of continuous improvement. I mean, I've heard people say that, of all 50 states, one of them has to have the highest female incarceration rate. But it doesn't need to be Idaho. It doesn't need to be a state that purports to pride itself on protecting its women and children.
That's a good point. We love being at the top of so many lists here in Idaho, but that's definitely not one of them that I think anybody wants to be at the top of. Well, I really appreciate you joining us here in the studio. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your leadership here in Idaho and for your thoughtful leadership and passion around not just addressing women's incarceration rates, but looking at being a solution leader and appreciate you joining Right on Crime.
Yeah, thanks for having me.